Like we're saying on News at Prime, and we continue now and turn to this. Concerns have been raised over claims about rape in South Africa still being shared online. According to Africa Check, scarce data is just one obstacle to combating sexual violence. For more on this, we're joined now by Keegan Leech, a researcher at Africa Check, and Gorata Chengeta, beg your pardon, a sexual violence researcher. Good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on this evening. Keegan, let's begin with you. How accurate is the information that we have, for example, around the rapes that are being committed in the country when you take that compared to the statistics that the South African police would give us now and again? Because I'm asking this because when the statistics come out and we have conversation, for example, with activists, they'll tell you that, well, we suspect those statistics because there are other cases, for example, that are going unreported. So the problem could be more severe than what is being reported.
That's true. It's very likely that rapes are underreported. The way that rape is defined and the way that rapes are recorded biases towards underreporting, but we don't really often know how severe that underreporting is. It's very hard to measure stats like that. And a lot of the claims that people share in an attempt to try and describe how bad that underreporting might be or how poorly addressed the problem of rape is in South Africa are themselves often unreliable or were reliable at some point but are years or even decades out of date by now.
So the world-renowned or widely shared statistics of 40% of South African women will be raped in their lifetime, or 1 in 9. Have you checked that at all as Africa Check?
Well, we have. That 40% stat that you mentioned is what we call a ghost stat. It's very widely reported or very widely repeated, but there isn't really a reliable source that we can find for that. The 1 in 9 claim did come from a very reliable source, except that claim is now decades old. It comes from data that was collected in 1998, and South Africa's legal landscape around rape has changed a lot since that time. Although Gorata will tell you that that's still a very helpful stat, and it has been very important in driving conversations around sexual violence in South Africa.
Yeah. Gorata, let's bring you in here. I suppose every bit of data is helpful, but how does data that is outdated impact on the work that needs to be done?
So, in my opinion, the use of statistics overall is not the most critical part of us trying to fight the sexual violence problem, because in using statistics and relying on them, we don't actually get to preventative measures for sexual violence, or rather against sexual violence. And we are also not looking at what the potential causes may be. So as we look at statistics as they fluctuate, as they increase or decrease, we then get preoccupied with trying to look at a micro part of the problem rather than looking at an overall landscape view of the issue.
But does it help, though, in informing policy, or are you saying even in the formation of policy, statistics would be relevant? Because now and again they'll say, well, government is not going to come up with a solution if they can't measure what the problem is. So you've got to measure the extent and the scope of the problem so that you can know what resource to deploy.
I think there's some truth to that in the sense that, particularly if we're looking at support service provision for people who've experienced sexual violence, we need to understand, okay, how many clinics are available that have something like, I think it's called post-exposure prophylaxis, the medication that you can take to prevent HIV prevention. We need statistics to know how many resources need to be deployed in preventing sexual violence and in responding to people and caring for people who've been affected by it. But I think that a reliance on statistics doesn't need to be the thing that mobilizes us to act, because we we anecdotally know that there is a big enough problem for it to merit attention, and we can move to interventions that don't rely on statistics, such as working on developing better cultural attitudes between gender groups and speaking about power relations in order to conscientize people about the causes of rape and the extent to which sexual violence is wrong.
Yeah. So when it comes to that support, what do we know, for example, around a Thuthuzela Center in relation to the community that it needs to serve?
So in my research, I don't particularly focus on Thuthuzela centers, but I think that the prevalence and the increase in Thuthuzela centers shows the kind of policy interventions that have been made that are not necessarily based on statistics, but are in line with how rape affects people. So the kinds of thoughts that have gone into the creation of Thuthuzela centers were based on listening to rape victims and rape survivors and thinking through what kind of support do they need if they are going to recover from the ordeal. And in terms of Thuthuzela centers, their capacity is also dependent on and affected by other structures in society, and they are not immune from the same kinds of structural issues and economic issues that affect any public health centers and institutions, for instance.
Yeah. And Keegan, when you define in terms of your reporting, statistics and the work that you've looked at, rape, do you break it down in terms of the offense of the abuse, whether it was physical, whether it was penetration or not? How do you break those statistics down?
So at Africa Check, we're working with statistics that other people have collected. And so what we try and do is just try and make it very clear how they are defining things. So we discuss in our report what the legal definition of rape and several other crimes are. But we also sometimes rely on surveys and other studies that use different definitions. It's very common that a survey will talk about something like sexual violence and define that in a way that is broader than just the legal definition of rape, and includes other experiences and other, or things that would be defined as other crimes, as a way of assessing what experiences people have had, because just using that legal definition or just reporting on, officially recorded rapes can often leave us with a slightly unclear or incomplete picture.
Yeah, and is there a picture that's beginning to emerge, for example, that would link the underreporting of rape to how communities would define rape? Maybe they would be using a much narrower definition of what rape is and therefore end up not reporting that particular incident.
Well, it doesn't it's hard to say whether rapes have gone unreported because people didn't think of it as rape. Often if in surveys that ask people, for example, why didn't you report a rape, then they're not necessarily going to be speaking to people who didn't think it was rape to begin with. They tend to get answers like the person had a fear of the repercussions that might come from reporting, or they didn't want the stigma of having been raped to be associated with them. Issues like that. Those tend to be the kinds of answers that we get.
Yeah. Gorata, the most, I suppose, recent and maybe even glaring issues, the one that's being raised around the police's ability to investigate sexual violence as crimes effectively and be able to gather evidence and put that evidence to court successfully. And I don't know if that is a statistic that we should be looking at, that we do have, and that can certainly put in the weight in terms of raising this issue of how badly cases are being investigated and evidence being collected.
I think, yeah, what you're speaking to, this belief around how police are handling rape cases, I think there's a significant amount of research that's not necessarily statistical. It aims to describe the different factors as to why rape cases are not always prosecuted or why rape is underreported, and looking at the complexity of the police system is very important. And also looking and remembering the complexity of rape as an experience is very important. For instance, rape does not affect everyone the same way. So within a system where we are hoping that people will feel comfortable to report rape cases, there are lots of factors that include the fear of stigma when people want to report rape. For communities that are marginalized, such as the LGBTI community, the stigma of homophobia and that fear of discrimination may also prevent people from reporting. And rape, because it's such a complex and psychologically traumatic experience a lot of the time, means that the process of reporting can also be quite difficult. And there are many reasons for which people who might open a rape case might not see that rape case through. So it's not as simple as, let's say, training the police to handle rape cases better, or assuming that, police are the main reason and the only reason that rape cases are not prosecuted and that it's an investigation failure. There are lots of different factors which go into the way in which one rape survivor might experience the reporting process, and also the particular context that they're in, because, all police stations are different, they are differently resourced, and there are lots of different factors that make the reporting process difficult and complicated, including something as simple as the targets of the prosecution and the availability of certain kinds of evidence and the chances they feel they can get a successful conviction based on the evidence that's available.
Right, let's leave it there for this evening. Much appreciated. Thank you both for coming on, Keegan Leech and Gorata Chengeta.